We continue this week of Locked On NHL in Utah. We're getting closer and closer to the 2024 NHL entry draft. We have a mock draft brought to you by all the other hosts of Locked On NHL, and we'll get that to you on today's episode of Locked On NHL in Utah.
You are Locked On NHL in Utah, your daily podcast on all things hockey in Utah, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to the show, everybody. I am your host, Robyn Leonio, alongside Tom Galhan. We want to thank everyone for making this show your first listen every day. We're free and available everywhere you get your podcast. It's mock draft day for all you NHL draft super fans. We're getting ready for the NHL draft in just about 2 weeks' time. We are getting closer and closer, Tom, and we're finally ready for that mock draft. Get some reaction out there before we even show the draft board. Just overall, how excited are you for the NHL draft as we're getting closer and closer?
As a Utah fan, I'm pretty pumped because last year, if you didn't follow the draft last year, something real weird happened. 0 trades. I can't remember the last time we saw 0 trades at the NHL draft. Heading into free agency, it was a strange year. This year, Utah has lots of assets and a couple of needs. That, to me, says Utah is going to be active and not only drafting, but trading. And I think coming in, having the most draft picks of any team in the draft is exciting. You're going to really see how Bill Armstrong is going to stock the cupboard here, but also what he's going to do in the near term as this team, this Utah hockey team, is building, moving into a year where really we should expect them to be a playoff bubble team. And I feel like this is a huge part of where they're going to turn the corner is this draft, this free agency period. So I'm really excited.
I want to address what you just mentioned earlier about this team being a playoff bubble team. So I feel like there are some Utah hockey fans or just some NHL hockey fans out there who don't see that quite yet. They're like, oh, this team's still in a rebuild. They're still early in the rebuild. They're not. They're not there anymore. They're about ready to compete.
And I think it was earlier this week, we talked about the teams that are behind Utah now.
Yeah.
And what you have to understand about the way the NHL does things. So there's 8 teams make the playoffs, East and West. It's top 3 in each division. And then there's number 7 and number 8 can come from either division. It's just then based on points. So that gives you probably a 4 or 5 team window of teams that can make it. So I'll say that's teams 7 through 11 or 7 through 12 that have a reasonable shot at getting into the playoffs. It can come right down to the final weekend of the season. I believe Utah has crept into that top 12. Now, if certain players continue to take steps forward this year, if they make the right moves in free agency, if they retain the right players and build a good defensive core, if they continue to see some development, they creep closer to number 8. I'm not saying this is the year they are number 8, but I'm saying this is the year they get over the hump of being 12 and are now in that mix and will be in that mix for this foreseeable future and grow stronger and stronger, and will climb. They'll go from 8 to 6 to, the middle of that pack, and then we'll see if they can challenge the elites.
And a lot of that really relies on how much trust you can take into General Manager Bill Armstrong on building through the draft, because that's what he has been focusing on, building through the draft. And that's what's coming up right now. And in getting that and addressing most of Utah's needs. And again, before we get into any of the actual mock draft, which I do want to share for everybody, I want to ask you, Tom, where do you see Utah's biggest needs and for specifically heading into the draft? Not necessarily just overall offseason, but specifically heading into the draft.
So coming into the draft, it's obvious defense is big because no one is signed for next year as of right now. There's 5 RFAs, 2 UFAs on defense. They really don't have that core there. Now, look, they're bringing back some of these guys. Not everybody's leaving, especially the RFAs. There's 5, which means restricted free agents. Teams can tender them an offer, retain their rights. There might be arbitration rights with some of these players. It means they'll be due a raise, but that's not a huge concern for Utah. The money is not a concern for Utah right now. So defensively, yes. This is going to be a year, and might affect Utah, but it's an active goalie market. And I don't think we've seen an active goalie market like this in a couple of years. In fact, it is the number one storyline into the draft and free agency. So there are a lot of guys who could be on the move. And for the first time in recent memory, not that there's not always a team looking for a number one, but I feel like there are more goaltenders available who are number ones. And before it was throwing $5 million at Jack Campbell. I'm looking at you, Edmonton. Like, that was a bad idea. But now there's Ullmark. Markstrom is in play. There's going to be some other goaltender, and some teams got to make some tough decisions too on some veteran guys. Minnesota just re-upped Marc-Andre Fleury for another year. Ottawa's got a choice to make here, but Minnesota's got a choice to make. And Vegas, who's your guy there? They kind of actually ended up going through three guys. Laurent Brossoit is out there as being available. I don't know if he's a number one. I actually don't think he is. I think he's a 1B. But I think as a 1B, he's an excellent 1B. But it's a really interesting market this year. And so, the Hurricanes have three goalies. They're going to have to move out on somebody. My hunch tells me it's Freddie Anderson. I don't know about that, but some of these guys are signed, so they have to be trades. They're not going to be free agents. That's why I think it's interesting to look at a Markstrom, a Freddie Anderson, whoever may be out there. And then there will be competition for the names that are available. So that's going to affect Utah because they will be a player in being able to benefit from teams who may have to shed some space to pick up a goalie or to, unload another contract. And they also, Robyn, have all those draft picks. So if some team is thinking they're out of their window, but they have an asset in net they're willing to move, Anaheim could move Gibson. How does that then play into it? So I think Utah is going to be a player in the draft. They're going to be a player in free agency, and it's also going to involve the trade market, not just picking up players at the draft in Vegas.
Fully expect Utah to be crazy active. It's interesting, and again, it goes to a lot of what Bill Armstrong has been doing. He's been not afraid to really, quote, swing for the fences. He's made some very interesting decisions. It's like either via trades which is interesting because some of the trades he's made were more of like, all right, we'll take on a quote dead contract, but it turns out that quote dead contract ends up being a good player. He somehow knows what to do, and he knows what's going to be in the most benefit for the team, and it's worked so far. And I'm curious to see how he's going to do it this offseason, specifically in the days leading up to the NHL draft, where I really hope to see some more activity.
And I think you will. I really can't imagine it's going to be a boring year. I think it's going to be a really active year. And now, we talked about it last week when we were previewing the Stanley Cup final. It's a copycat league. A lot of teams in the league will follow the blueprint of who gets there. Well, guess what? This is two completely different blueprints in Edmonton and Florida, yet they're both playing in the final. So some GMs are going to go one way, some GMs are going to go the other way. But now it opens up more possibilities, more landing spots for a lot of guys, different positional type players that might blend in different spots where maybe they didn't before. So everybody's going to be tweaking, adjusting, rearranging, because they have to catch Florida or they have to catch Edmonton. Those are your new targets.
One thing I want to ask you before we go into the actual mock draft, and which again, this is something that I am going to mention, when we do get to that mock draft reaction. But one of the things I've mentioned multiple times earlier this week, and even in the couple weeks before then, is taking a look at the MO that Bill Armstrong has done going into the drafts, saying what kind of guy does he draft? It's most of the time it's been big, physical, sometimes Russian hockey players. Is that MO going to play into a major factor come number 6? Do you see that, or will there be a little bit of a change?
I think tendencies are important to note when it comes to a GM and a staff and how they draft. I don't think just because you go from Arizona to Utah, you're a different person. If that is your archetype of the team you want to build. And I do like a big physical defense first team that scores opportunistically like Florida. That is my blueprint. If I were a GM, that is how I would build my team. And because when you've got the puck, you're really playing defense. Puck possession is amazing for your defensive numbers because if you've got it and you're shooting, you're scoring goals, not the other team. So how do you do that? Well, you're bigger, you're stronger, you're more physical, you work more, battles in the corners, 50-50 pucks, you win those battles. That's how you do that. That's how you're a better team. So if that's how you build, I'm not going to wake up one day and go, man, you know what I want? I want just 3 lines of guys who just fly and don't play defense. That's not going to happen. So I don't think we're going to see much of a radical shift in the idea behind the core of this hockey team. I just think we'll see a lot more action around it. Whether they keep all those picks or not, I feel like they're not going to. I feel like they're going to use some of them to bring in guys who are already proven NHL commodities.
Yeah, it would be very interesting to see exactly how that works. But let's get to that mock draft reaction. First, a quick word from our sponsors. And today's episode is brought to you by Gametime. Gametime makes it easier getting tickets to your favorite sporting events even faster and easier. Prices on the Gametime app usually go down the closer it gets to the event with killer last-minute deals, all-in pricing, views from your seats, the lowest price guarantee. Gametime takes the guesswork out of buying tickets for all kinds of events in your area. So not just sporting events, but concerts, comedy shows, you name it. You can use the app listed and customize your spot and maybe can find as an inspiration of the kind of seat that you're specifically looking for. Once again, with their last minute deals, flash deals, zone deals, etc. Easy to find and buy tickets for all kinds of events, views from your seats, lowest price guarantee, event cancel protection, job loss protection, and my favorite feature, all-in pricing. Toggle this feature that show you the total upfront with no surprise fees at checkout. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, use the code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account, redeem code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your purchase. Download Gametime today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. All right, Tom, let's get to the moment I think a lot of people have been waiting for, anxiously waiting to see what the full draft board of 32 looks like for the first round. It's brought to you by all the hosts of Locked On NHL of what the mock draft might look like in just a couple of weeks' time. And here it is. It looks like, again, no surprise, Sharks taking Macklin Celebrini, but could very well change going from number 2 to number 12, let's say. It's a very toss-up draft this year, Tom.
It is. And again, we talk about how, you could go one way or another. Chicago, in this case, in this mock draft, opting to go with a forward. I think that, both the Ducks and the Hawks probably, and depending on which way you go, you could go defense very easily for either one of those two. Obviously, Celebrini is kind of cemented in there with the Sharks. So, if you're the Ducks, I feel like you're very talented up front. You haven't had the best defensive core. You've been very porous. You've been let in a lot of goals. I think you need to address defense. Chicago is also kind of languishing towards the back of the league, but they're in a rebuild. But is the temptation to get somebody to play with Bedard still, or to try to make the rest of your scoring better? And again, this comes back to, Robyn, what you were talking to earlier about what is your focus and what does the GM look for? But then, you see Blue Jackets going forward, and Canadians going forward, and then NHL and Utah. Well, no shocker, defense, right?
Right.
And then the next 3 right behind them, or I should say the next 2 right behind them, but 3 in a row, there's 6, 7, and 8, all defensemen. And Dickinson or Byam could easily come to Utah as well. Any of those players could end up with Utah NHL if they draft to the position of need. Now, again, it depends who slides down the board too, right? I mean, if you have somebody for some reason, let's just say, and it happens, you made a great example, talking about guys sliding down the board earlier. And, what if Demidov slides down the board? He's a forward. And all of a sudden he's there at number 6 and you have him, he's the highest rated guy after Celebrini on your draft board. Do you take him? Do you need a forward? Well, you can always use a better forward, right? I mean, if he's better than someone else, that's the other thing. People think, well, if I'm taking this guy, he's got to automatically be on my top line. My response to that is no. You draft a player because you think they take a spot on your roster.
Yes.
Are they part of the 18 that you're dressing? 18 and 2. Are they part of the 18 that you're dressing? And if that's the case, then I don't see why you don't have that person as a draft pick. Or even down the road, as you get in the later rounds, in rounds 5, 6, and 7, could you project this player in your top 18 or as part of your starting goaltending rotation? That's why I think you make those picks.
It's a really interesting thought, and I feel like a lot of people need to realize that there are some GMs who will draft based off their ceiling. There's like, oh, this player's ceiling is elite top pair defenseman, like super elite top pair defenseman. But maybe they didn't take a look at their floor, which is AHL guy. Again, that's a very wide range, but again, that's a very high possibility, especially with defensemen who take a little bit longer to develop. On the flip side, there could be a GM in the first round who goes and looks at a defenseman. And again, I'm using defenseman as an example because that's where, again, Utah picked, as in this mock draft specifically, they're picking Zane Parekh. And it's there. You could look at it where it's like, okay, their floor is a guaranteed NHL defenseman. And but their ceiling is second pair. Maybe borderline first pair, depending on the team. Like, those are different philosophies, and I feel like that should be discussed based off specifically the kind of team that you currently have.
Right. And so, and I'll ask you specifically about your pick for Parekh here. But you do have those, kind of 3 defensemen, but it's like, okay, do you want the 6'4" guy? Do you want, because Parekh is 6'1", 178 right now. Plus, keep in mind, these guys, like, some of them still grow a little bit. But what do you want? And Parekh is an offensive defenseman, puck moving guy, good vision, whatever. Dickinson's a good skater, can play big minutes, can produce offensively, but, or do you want a guy who, we hear guys described in various ways, but like, okay, do you want a good first pass? Do you want a good leader? Do you want a stay-at-home shutdown defenseman? What are you looking for to go along with these guys? Plus, do not underestimate that sometimes it literally comes down to, do you shoot left or right? Because right-hand shot defensemen are at a premium all the time in the NHL. A right-hand shot defenseman is always going to command a premium. It's like a left-handed pitcher in baseball. They're just worth more. If they're all things considered, you have a lefty and a righty defenseman who are, let's say, NHL, EA Sports NHL rating, 99 players, both of them, you're going to take the right-hand shot guy because he's just more valuable. So sets up the one time in the power play. If everybody can move the puck, you want the right-hand shot guy who can move the puck.
And you know what, Tom? I'll give you my reasoning, my specific reasoning behind picking Parekh over the other 2 defensemen right after a quick word.
Hey, Locked On Utah NHL fans, I want to take a moment to bring up one of our partners, the mobile game Ultimate Hockey GM. If you've ever dreamed of becoming an NHL GM, and I know you have, managing your own hockey franchise, do you think you could run Utah better than Bill Armstrong? I know some of you do. Well, your dream can come true, and this game is most definitely for you. So manage every strategic aspect of the team, play through the seasons, and let it lead you to glory, the Stanley Cup. If you hire the right coaches and the staff, trade players, or draft picks, navigate free agency, the draft, all that, all in a challenging and realistic game world. As a Utah fan, there's no off season. we're talking about it right now. GMs are constantly making moves at every point of the year to improve their team's chances. And that's why I think you're going to love this game. So check it out. Ultimate Hockey GM is completely free and playable offline too. So that's a big one. You can play on the go as you want, when you want to, where you want. By the way, Locked On Network listeners get a 100% free boost to their franchise when using the promo code Locked On NHL. That's LOCKEDON NHL, and use that in a game store. So make sure to check it out. Download the game. Visit hockeygm.app. That's hockeygm.app. Or, of course, you can check it out in your mobile store as well. Ultimate Hockey GM. Start your dynasty today.
So, no, I know, Tom, you were asking me about my reasoning behind going into this mock draft on selecting Zane Parekh. And it's interesting because when the draft came up, the top 4 did not surprise me. I was sure that Sam Dickinson was actually going to get picked at number 5, and it was like, okay, it would have been easy. Zane Parekh still is going to be the pick. But they picked when the Canadians picked Tisha Ginla, it really made it difficult for me. I'm like, all right, now I got multiple defensemen to focus on. What specifically am I focusing on?
Right.
And it's a lot of different conversations that I've had with other scouts and other draft experts, prospect experts. You kind of helped lead me to think about this. I could have easily picked Dickinson, who had a very high floor. I think he was described as the most NHL ready defenseman in this draft class, or could have picked a guy like Parekh, who had an extremely high ceiling. I think probably could be the highest ceiling among defensemen in this draft class, or even a third player who I didn't even mention was even lower in this draft class, on pick number 13, and Anton Selayev, who perfectly fits the MO for Bill Armstrong. So I was having an incredibly hard time, Tom, picking who I thought would have picked. Then I thought to me, okay, last season, last first round, Bill Armstrong picked Dmitry Shemishev. Big guy, big defenseman. Even though that is Bill Armstrong's MO, I don't think he wants to completely stack guys like that. And he maybe gets a right shot, offensively minded, puck moving defenseman who can complement Dmitry Shemishev when he comes on over to the North American game. That was my reasoning. Like, not just what's the MO, but what's the kind of player who could potentially complement Shemishev and some of the other defensemen that Utah will have on the roster in a few years' time.
I think that's sound reasoning, because, again, right shot, power play, puck moving defensemen, they don't grow on trees. They have high value, especially when they're under team control and you draft those guys. One other defenseman I wanted to throw in there could have fit that mold, Carter Yaremchuk, from Calgary in the Western League, 6'3", 202 already at 18 years old. He's only going to get bigger. But I understand, and I think for Utah, here's the thing. And of course, this depends a lot on what the plans are for guys you're going to re-sign. If you have a big, bulky blue line, one of my favorite defense pairs of all time were like the odd couple, Felix and Oscar. But if you look back at Brian Rafalski and Nicholas Lidstrom, those two just different, both equally skilled for different reasons. Lidstrom was a big guy. He was very strong. Rafalski was a little more crafty, puck-moving guy. But man, they just worked. And I think that you can have that kind of dynamic on whether it's your power play, whether it is now look, Nicholas Lidstrom was a generational talent, like incredibly smart player. But if you can get even a little bit of that, just a sliver of how good that deep pair was, and you can have it with a lefty-righty matchup, why wouldn't you do that? So I don't mind that pick at all. I think that would be really, really interesting to see. And you know what? Hockey IQ goes a long way.
Mm-hmm. And I want to ask you this. Maybe this could be a different mindset or whatever it might be. Kind of want to get your thoughts about it. But how much do you think, and as I bring the graphic up one more time, how much do you think that the recent Memorial Cup, where we saw essentially Perek against Dickinson in the Memorial Cup final, play into the fact that these guys are at 6 and 7?
It's interesting too, because everybody likes a winner, right? And I think that it's interesting, Saginaw, London, would that be flip-flopped if London, had managed to finish and win? And here's the other thing too. Sometimes there's a bias in junior hockey between Western Hockey League, Ontario Hockey League, Quebec Major Junior. Then there's also a bias between junior hockey and college hockey. Some scouts and some GMs don't like international players as much, or they'd rather have a Finnish guy. Like there's all these little things that go into the biases, right? So, it's interesting to see that London, who I don't want to say a lot of people anointed them the champs, but I think a lot of people anointed them the champs.
Right.
And then they didn't win. Could that affect you a little bit? I think, unfortunately, yes, it could, even though it does take 18 guys to win or lose a hockey game. So maybe that does have a little bit to do with it. That's not out of the question.
It very well isn't. So, and again, I don't think it surprises either way. I think even before the Memorial Cup came up, those two names were already on the top. They were already top 10
absolutely
skaters already. We already knew that. I feel like it was no surprise at all. It was kind of like, all right, when are these guys can be available? Because I felt like, to me, like as I mentioned, Dickinson could have easily been a top 5 pick. Correct? Because he could have easily been a top, like any of them could have been a top 5.
Sure. And I think there is, again, there's a clear cut number 1 here, right? But then from 2 to maybe 8 or 9, I really think any of those guys, you could put them in a salad spinner and shoot them out anywhere. But it really depends on the preferences of the team, what they're looking for, and the particular biases of the GM and scouting staff. So that's really what we're looking at. It's some years there's a gap, right? It's 3 and then everybody else. Some years it's a gap. It's top 4 or just the first 2 and then everybody else. This year it is the top guy and everybody else. So that's just the way the draft class works.
So we mentioned the top 10. Anything else that stuck out to you when we in this mock draft that you think that probably could be either surprise to you or maybe something that you think is just about right, that you think is it seems to be accurate for you?
You know what? So to go back to talking about for the Buffalo Sabres here, Yakemchuk, having him at 11 again, the Sabres pick another defenseman. They already have such a beast of a D-core there. They've got Owen Power, Rasmus Dahlin. They just traded for Bowen Byram coming over from the Avalanche. Man, really? Another defenseman. Not that, like I say, not that it's a bad thing, but Buffalo had a player in Skinner that regressed this year, and he got himself going back in again. Lindy Ruff is coming in to coach, so that's also going to have something to do with it. But they really feel pretty set, pretty young on D. Buffalo just couldn't score goals. They just could not score goals. And keeping him out's not going to be a problem for this team. Devin Levi is going to be there, probably not next year. I think they're actually going to end up having him in the American League, but he'll get there eventually. I think goal scoring is what they need. And I think for Buffalo, that was a little bit of a surprise in this draft for me, for them to have listed as another defenseman. Although other places also have Buffalo picking another defenseman. So that's not a huge reach, but it was probably the biggest surprise I pulled out of all that.
I think what's interesting, I feel like it kind of just goes with the storyline that this draft is a defense draft. Like, yes. I feel like, and I think that's what needs to be said. Like, yeah, sure, there are a lot of good forwards out there, and you take a look at the top two players who are getting drafted from the mock draft are forwards: Macklin Celebrini and Ivan Demidov. Like, it's as what can you just see past that is it's all defensemen. Let's take a look. I'm gonna bring it up one more time. You have let's see how many. 1, 2, 3, 4. Is that 4 defensemen in the top 10, and then you have an additional 5, 6. Yeah, so 6 in the top 15. It looks like
that's why if a guy like a Demidov falls, or if a guy like a Lindstrom falls, or an Iginla falls to you if you're the Sabres at 11. Not saying that Demidov will be there, I doubt it, but let's say Iginla is. Right?
Yeah,
he projects to be available around there. I might reach for him instead of another defenseman.
right.
And those are choices everybody's going to have to make at that point. So, but I think as far as the quality, now that's the other thing we talk about gaps. So you want to talk about skaters, whether it's forwards and defensemen. Okay, there might be 5 really elite forwards. There might be 5 really elite defensemen. But if you think there's only 5 elite forwards and you're picking 9th and those 5 forwards are gone, then even if you don't necessarily need a defenseman right now, because keep in mind, with very few exceptions, in fact, probably one exception, maybe 2 this year, Celebrini, we know will be on the Sharks. Okay, yeah. He's going to be there opening night. But outside of him, who's going to be on your opening night roster? This is it might be a year or 2, and you don't know what's going to happen in that year or 2. So I think you got to pick your best available player.
And best available, and kind of going back to what we mentioned earlier this week, but also best fit for your specific needs and your specific system.
Yes, absolutely. I think that culture matters.
Yeah, and again, not even going that, but let's say system, for example. Like, if you are a all grit team, like nothing but grit, which I don't think we see very much of that anymore. And what are the chances that you're going to pick somewhat a undersized skill player? That it usually doesn't happen.
So again, let's take a look at Edmonton, and one of the shortcomings of Edmonton has been goaltending and defense. They've gotten better defensively. And now look at what they've done, because they are so talented up front, but they still don't really have an answer to their goaltending issue. But Stuart Skinner, to win the Stanley Cup, he could be average, and they could win if they were keeping the chances down. And I think actually Skinner's played well, but the elite forwards just haven't shown up. Like, these losses aren't on Stuart Skinner. These losses are on Edmonton not scoring and Florida shutting them down. So, but it got them to the Cup final. So Edmonton needed to get better defensively. They were terrible there for years, and it wasn't enough to get them deep in the playoffs. Well, they got better defensively, and look where they are. They're in the Stanley Cup final. So yeah, that is Edmonton adding to its position of need and seeing the come on effect from that is now we're in the Stanley Cup final. That is exactly what every team wants to do. They want to look at their positions of need, address them, and watch their team improve.
And that's kind of what a lot of this is about. The draft, free agency, trades is getting everything you need in the system that's going to work for your team. That's going to work to get you to the Stanley Cup, because that is the goal. It's not like, all right, let's see if I can put my perfect team in there. I mean, obviously, every GM has their vision, but if some pieces aren't working, they got a tool. They got to move pieces in, move pieces out, see what works. Because sure, system is one thing too, as I mentioned, but also chemistry. Can that player work with the rest of your?
And in my opinion, and some GMs would be fine with this, but you don't want to build around one player. Yes. You want the player to come in who you can build around what you've already built and make another part of the structure and be a strong part of the structure, can be the primary leg supporting the whole thing. But you don't want that player to have to carry the world.
Which is why, and we're running out of time here, so I want to put this thought on here, which is why Bill Armstrong has an incredible opportunity ahead of him, because taking a look at what's being built around now is you got Clayton Keller, you got now Logan Cooley, Dylan Guenther. You got so many core / future pieces in there those are the guys you're building around.
Yeah. And I don't want, I know we're running up against the end of the clock because there's a lot of things you could say about that, but Utah fans, there's a lot to be excited about right now, the way this team is, and that's before the draft and before free agency.
And this draft is only going to get you even more excited because, again, I feel like I'll bring up a draft guy to get a lot more in depth about Zane Parekh. We've already had a couple guys already talk about him on this show, but let's get a little more in depth because and again, that's the reason why I picked him. I feel like he is the most exciting player that would be available at around 6 for Utah to pick. And I feel like that is another reason to be all excited for.
And he'd have a reasonable shot at making the team this year.
Oh, yeah, no doubt about it. That's, of course, if he decided to come back, too. But, right. Because he could decide to go back to juniors one more season, truly.
Well, and you know, that's why you bring him into camp. You bring him to development camp. You look at them in training camp and you see where they are and you put them through their paces. And you find some guys need to put on 20 more pounds or spend more time in the gym or something. But other guys might make the transition seamlessly. Like Cale McCarr, when he jumped to the NHL, it looked like he'd been in the NHL for 5 years. There was zero transition period for him coming out of UMass. He looked amazing right away. Not everybody's Cale.
Absolutely. Any final thoughts before I close things off?
No, just want to remind everybody about the draft party that's going to be down there at the Delta Center. Doors open at 4. That's going to be an awful lot of fun. I'm excited about the draft. So, of course, you can keep it here on Locked On Utah NHL. We're going to have all kinds of draft coverage. It's going to be a lot of fun.
Absolutely. Well, that's going to be it for today's episode. If you like what you heard, don't forget to leave a review, like, comment, subscribe if you have yet to already. If you're listening on YouTube, don't forget to hit that notification bell as well, so you get notified every time a new episode drops. Don't forget to interact with us on social media. We're on Facebook, facebook.com/LockedOnNHL in Utah, or on the app formerly known as Twitter, now known as X, at @LO_NHL Utah. I am at Robyn_Leano, and Tom Callahan is at Callahan on Air. Interact with us. Ask us the question. We will answer right back or on a future episode of the Locked On NHL in Utah podcast. Thanks again, everyone, for listening to today's episode, and we'll see you guys next time.